And one. Hold on. Smile. Come on, guys. Smile. 1, 2. Coming up next on Rugby Wrap-Up, Matt McCarthy and Steve Lewis with Toronto Arrows star Dan Moor. Rugby Wrap-Up brought to you in part by Irish Rugby Tours, the Rugby Tours people. A balanced palate, nutrition for peak performance. AFIA Sports Training Group, and Pig and Whistle on West 36th Street, the world's best rugby pub. Hey everybody, welcome back to Rugby Wrap-Up. Matt McCarthy with Steve Lewis in Midtown Manhattan at the Fantasy Sports Network Studio 34, talking Major League Rugby. And Steven, we're crossing the border today.
We are going north, our northern cousins. We want to know what's going on up there.
Yes, indeed. And we have none other than Dan Moor of the Toronto Arrows with us here on Rugby Wrap-Up. Dan, welcome.
Hey, guys. Thanks so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Or should we say bienvenue?
Both work up here.
Fair enough. How's your French?
Very poor, unfortunately.
Well, we can tutor them. In all seriousness, Toronto Arrows, very exciting. You're in the Major League Rugby setup. You've given up a lucrative career in the financial sector because you went to Oxford after going to Queen's University. You actually played a little professional rugby with Carnegie, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Yorkshire, Carnegie, based out of Leeds in the north of England.
Right. I'm familiar with Leeds. Great place. Great vibe there for the rugby. And now you're back here, and they talked you into coming onto the Arrows. And you've got caps with Canada as well. Yeah,
I mean, I was playing in Leeds. And, the Arrows is obviously getting built in Toronto, which is my hometown, where I was born and raised. And I thought it was just such a tremendous opportunity to come back and be part of something. It's not just great for rugby in Toronto, my hometown, but I think more broadly Canada. I think this is the path to, hopefully make our national team more competitive on the global stage. And so, it's a really, really exciting development in the Canadian rugby landscape. And when the opportunity came up through Bill Webb and Mark Winokur, I just jumped at it.
So quick question. You do know Mark Winokur is not Canadian, right?
I do know that. Yeah, I think he tries to hide it from most. So you guys have obviously done your research.
No, we know him well.
He's Jersey white trash like I am.
Anyway,
I'll tell him he said that.
Back to rugby. So the setup with Toronto, you guys up there, how often do you train? I mean, there's different models down here depending on the ratio of full-time players to part-time players. What's the setup there? How often do you guys get together? Where do you train? The weather must be tricky right now. Talk us through it.
So we train Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. Those sessions, Tuesdays and Thursdays are a bit longer so that we can get the whole club in terms of, our full-time players and our part-time players. Those are sort of 2 hours later in the evening to accommodate, all the various schedules. But, up to this point, the facilities have been great. As you mentioned with the weather, we're right now training indoors in a dome in Whitby. Most of our facilities are out there as it relates to strength and conditioning and that whole sort of realm of our program. But we were lucky enough to spend a week out on the West Coast in Victoria. We went to the Rugby Canada Centre of Excellence and trained with the national team program for that week as well. So, it was nice to break it up. That was fantastic in terms of just being able to get outside as a team. We had a sort of practice game against a rough Canada squad there as well. So that was, instrumental for our preseason build-up to our first MLR campaign, which we're really thrilled to be a part of.
So no question that the MLR last year, first season, helped the Eagles, right? Guys in a regular training environment, daily training environment, and it really was reflected in the national team's performance. Obviously, with the bulk, 40% perhaps of the Canadian squad with Toronto, this is really going to help Canadian rugby, the national team. Do you believe that to be the case?
Yeah, Steve, I think you're absolutely right. Now with the international game and the number of professional leagues around the world, it's absolutely vital for unions like Canada and the United States to be building that player pool, adding depth from a standpoint of making sure that guys are playing full time or in a professional environment. So I think the Arrows could really be a game changer for rugby in our nation. Just adding another sort of 20 guys that are playing full time. And I think even beyond that, there's been a centralized system set up on the west coast of Canada that was in Victoria. I was lucky enough to be a part of that for 1 year. It was a great experience, but being based out there, I don't think you get a number of high quality games week in, week out, which I think you really need in order to develop as a rugby player. As you mentioned, I was lucky enough to go over to England, and even at Oxford, I got to experience good teams week in, week out. And I think, for a young player that's trying to develop, that's trying to get better at their game, it's all about game time. And unfortunately, that's something I think on the West Coast of Canada we're slightly missing. But with the Arrows, there's a 16-game schedule of really high-quality opponents. So as I mentioned, I think it could be a real game changer for rugby in Canada.
So Dan, you mentioned the 16-game schedule. It hasn't actually shined warmly upon your faces with the 8 games on the road out of the gate. Plus, after your first game, you guys started to get on track in the second half, and then you had a bye. And now you have the ARCs. How's that mix of ARCs, the schedule, and the bye affect you guys mentally?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there's a number of factors that are posing a challenge, but I think everything in life is how you approach it, and I think the way we're going about it is the right way, with positive mindset, looking at it as an opportunity rather than a challenge. I think those first 8 weeks on the road, as you mentioned, could actually be a real asset for our team. It's no secret that you get as a teammate and build stronger bonds just being around each other 24/7 in the hotel rooms, etc. So that might actually be vital for our season, just being able to get closer as a group, and then having hopefully being able to come home and sort of build a fortress, as they say, in terms of our home stadium.
Did you guys have any conversations about how many wins you feel you need to have on the road, or are you just taking it one game at a time?
No, we're just focused on one game at a time. As you mentioned, obviously we had a stronger second half against NOLA. I thought there was a lot of good things that we can build from, and that's what we've been sort of focused on over the last 2 weeks. You look at that first half, there's a lot of room for improvement. So it's actually a blessing, I think, that we had a bye this past weekend. There was lots of mistakes in that first half, and we've had double the amount of training sessions we'd get compared to a normal week to right those wrongs. So and obviously the boys getting a bit fresher as well. So hopefully we can go into Austin this Friday night firing on all cylinders.
On the coaching, who's doing what? You got Carpenter, you got Silverthorne. Who's responsible for what there?
Chris Silverthorne is our director of rugby, so he's really overseeing all the coaching that's being done, and then we have sort of 3 or 4 coaches working below him in sort of different capacities. Aaron Carpenter, is the most capped Canadian in Test history, has our defense and our forwards. He's also aided by a scrum coach, Dave Butcher, who comes in from my alma mater, Queen's University, and then we have really 2 guys that are focused on the backs. Corey Hector, who coaches at the University of Guelph, and then Pete Smith, who joined us from the Championship Seattle team last year. Decorated player, but good coach as well. So a lot of strength in numbers, I think, in the coaching staff, and they're all adding value up to this point. So it's been fantastic.
On the player side, who's a player that fans should look for with the Arrows?
I think, particularly being based in Toronto, I think there's sort of the local club, or guys that have been in the local club scene for years that people will be really excited about. One guy that I've just sort of recently met, because he grew up on the West Coast, is Theo Sauter. He's our 15. He's currently away with Canada, but he's got some sweet feet. He's really embarrassed me in practice a couple times. Had a really nice tally this weekend against Uruguay as well. I think he's a young and up-and-comer who's really burst onto the scene. Obviously, Lucas Rumble, being a Toronto native, and captaining the squad this year is going to be a fantastic player to watch. A guy like Andrew Ferguson, he's been on the scene for a while. He's had some unfortunate run of injuries and maybe misselect.
You broke up there a little bit, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. You mentioned the match against Uruguay. Do you think that you guys might consider bringing in some of your other big guns in the future, or is it just getting players blooded in a match like Uruguay? Because it was a tough loss for you guys. Yeah,
it was a tough loss. I think the guys that are down there, though, can get the job done. I know they're going to be working really hard this week, getting better, obviously, for their next match this weekend. Yeah, I have no insights into how Rugby Canada is going to be approaching that tournament moving forward. I think it's absolutely vital, as we were talking earlier, about giving opportunities for guys, increasing the depth of that player pool in terms of who's actually exposed to the test level. Because as you guys know well, you go on a string of injuries, there could be 9-10 players at any point in time. You don't want guys being called up into big summer tests and stuff with no prior experience. So I think the ARC is an absolutely fantastic tournament for Canada and increasing that player depth.
Stephen, you have a question for him, right?
Yeah, one question, one observation. So the question is Canada sticking with the same squad for the full 5-6 weeks, or are they rotating a little bit like the US are?
I'm actually not sure. I actually don't have that insight. They'll obviously be managing bodies with the big travel schedule, and then also presumably some of the injuries that may occur. So I'm not sure at this point in time.
Okay, and the observation was goal kicker. You need a goal kicker.
Yeah. Oh, in Canada in general. I mean, there are some guys who've been good goal kicking over the last couple of years. And I'm not exactly sure where that skill set sits over the next couple of weeks. I think there's guys who definitely can kick, and I think one-off is not necessarily define a player, that kind of thing. I think this week they'll be working hard to make sure that some of those penalties continue to tick over on the Canada scoreboard.
Sure.
All right, my friend. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, taking the time. Steve, final thoughts for Dan?
Yep. Enjoy the season, mate. Enjoy it.
Enjoy the warm weather down in Austin.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on, guys. Really appreciate it. And thanks for covering the Arrows in a big U.S. market sort of focused production. So appreciate it.
You got it, my friend. On behalf of Mr. Dan Moore of the Toronto Arrows and Mr. Steve Lewis, I'm Matt McCarthy at the Fantasy Sports Network Studio 34 in New York City, talking rugby, but signing off for now. Matthew Paul Patrick McCarthy here with Daniel Andrew Garnault Moore.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. How does one watch his assumed beloved Toronto Maple Leafs from Oxford?
To be honest, I'm not a Leafs fan, actually. I'm a Calgary Flames fan, so it's a bit of a curveball I throw at you. Yeah. Grew up in the days of Theo Fleury. He was such a warrior. I've always been a fan ever since.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Do you get, what's that like? You're wearing a Calgary Flames sweater in Toronto, is that it?
I mean, you get a little bit of hate for sure. Yeah. I mean, especially whenever there's a grudge match between Toronto and Calgary. My buddies and myself, have a bit of a rivalry, so it's good to kind of chirp each other back and forth.